My name is Nick Gallant and I'm a professor at the Bartlett School of Planning, and I convene the series. We've been running the series for about 15 years, I think now. My piece of paper says 15 years, but I think my piece of paper has said 15 years for 5 years. So maybe it's longer than 15 years. Tonight's speaker is Professor Simin Davoudi from the University of Newcastle. Simin is a Professor of Town Planning and co-director for the Centre for Researching Cities at the university. She's a former president of the Association of European Schools of Planning, and she's still heavily involved with ASOP. She's a fellow of the Royal Town Planning Institute, trustee of the TCPA with me, that's a lot of fun, and a trustee of the Academy of Social Sciences. She's held visiting professorships around the world in the US, the Netherlands, Sweden, Australia, Finland and Austria, and she's been advisor to the UK government, a number of other bodies across Europe and research councils on matters academic and planning related. She's written very widely on planning. Many of you will be familiar with her various works. I should say that she's also a co-author of the most recent edition of Town and Country Planning. And that's a book that I'm sure we all have on our shelves, yeah? Particularly if you're studying planning. I think it's often referred to as the Bible of planning. If planning has a Bible, that's the one. Also, I should say that Simin was a colleague a few years back.
Yes.
When did you leave UCL?
1996.
You left UCL?
No, sorry. I
came to UCL.
I came to UCL in 1996, left 2000.
2000, yeah. So a few years ago. It seems like only yesterday.
You're just 25 years ago.
I thought it was probably about 10 years ago.
Yeah, yes.
Anyway,
yes, time flies, yes.
Time
when you
flies.
have fun.
So drawing on her work, the subject of her lecture tonight is Prefigurative Planning, Enacting Utopias in the Here and Now. So over to you, Simin. There will be a chance for us to ask questions at the end and engage in some discussion. But the floor is yours, and welcome back to UCL after all of these years.
After all of these years.
Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's great to have such an audience in a day like this. I am telling you, despite the stereotype, the weather in Newcastle is much, much better. Lots of lovely, dry, sunny, cold, but sunny and crispy weather. So you're all welcome to come and visit us in Newcastle. Thank you very much, Nick, for that introduction and for inviting me to come and share some thoughts with colleagues here. It's a real great pleasure to do so. And I know we are pressed for time, and it would be nice to have sort of decent time at the end for discussions and dialogues. So I'm just going to make a start. And at the heart of my lecture, basically, is a call to revisit the utopian tradition, which was once
the driving force behind planning and its progressive intents. I'll talk about why this is important, how we might be able to do this through a prefigurative mode of planning that offers different ways of addressing some of the challenges that we face today. And what would be a better start to a lecture on utopian thinking than a quote from a renowned speculative fiction writer. Speaking in her award ceremony in 2014, Ursula Le Guin urged her fellow writers to envisage alternatives to how we live now and to imagine real grounds for hope when hard times are coming. Today, more than a decade later, hard times are getting harder in the context of climate breakdown, growing inequalities, declining public services, rising prejudices and divisions, and widespread mistrust of democratic institutions of which planning aspires to be one. There is a growing sense of the loss of the future, especially amongst the younger generations, as these statistics can only give the barest of indication. Many people think that children will have a worse quality of life than their parents. When it comes to planning, hard times are getting even harder in the context of debilitating cuts to its power and resources and demoralizing assaults on its efficacy, validity, and legitimacy. There seems to be an institutional culture in the government that blames planning for everything that goes wrong. A culture that began to take hold in the 1980s and has since seeped into the wider public perception of planning. Decades of neoliberalizing reforms have stripped planning from its creative potentials, reduced it to a series of tick-box procedures, as you can see from these testimonies quoted in an RTPI commissioned report, and repeated actually recently. I was reading Ben's very nice piece in the Planner in a most recent research which was done by colleagues in Sheffield, Newcastle, and UCL. Struggling to sustain and convey its public accountability and democratic legitimacy, planning is perceived to have become disconnected from the public and increasingly beholden to developers rather than the people it's meant to serve. One of the unsettling consequences of all of this is what David Harvey once called the sclerosis of imagination, to the extent that no one believes anymore that we can build that city on a hill. A creeping pessimism and an absence of hope for the future have led to a reluctance to imagine places that do not yet exist. Utopian thinking seems to have been assigned to the dustbin of planning ideas. But without it, planning becomes a technocratic and bureaucratic exercise. That is why we need a return to utopianism as a vital force in planning and its progressive intents. As a key function of hope, utopian thinking helps us to see the existing conditions not as how things are, but as how they are made to be and how they might be unmade or remade. It is this combination of criticality and creativity which is at the heart of prefigurative planning. I'll elaborate on these a little bit, but first, I should emphasize that prefiguration as a concept is not new. It has a very long history in social movement, scholarship, and activism. Put it simply, it suggests that signs of radical change are prefigured in the present, that we can build the new in the shell of the old, but without limiting the new to the boundaries of the old. So prefiguration is about a range of social and spatial experiments that critique the status quo while at the same time pursue future alternative or utopic social relations in the present. Prefigurative action have been on the rise, actually, since the 2008 financial crisis. And it's also been debated very widely in many disciplines, ranging from politics to psychology, but not that much in planning, which is a bit intriguing given the future-oriented nature of planning. So my attempt, and it is only an attempt, to fill that gap should be seen as a first step towards understanding what prefiguration is, why it's important, how it can be embedded in planning practices, and not necessarily to replace all other forms of planning, but to complement them. In applying it to planning, I've combined this concept with the notion of concrete utopia, which was introduced in the 50s by the German philosopher Ernst Bloch in his book, The Principle of Hope. The book is widely credited for renewing interest in utopian thinking. So I have drawn on these ideas to suggest that prefigurative planning entails two interconnected processes. One is a critical process of negating the given realities, and the other is a normative process of creating new realities and enacting utopic futures, plural, in the here and now. And I'm going to say a few words about this in turn. In terms of the negation of the given, let's first have a quick reminder of some of the narratives that have been normalized as undisputed realities. So we are told that the relentless pursuit of capitalist growth is the solution to all of our social and environmental problems. And market transactions provide the optimal mechanism for governing our social relations. That maximizing private profit lifts everyone up, and trickle-down economics create leveled up geographies. That hedonistic consumption generates happiness and well-being, and that the only true measure of progress is GDP. Related to the field of planning, we are told that cities should function like growth machines by rolling out financialized real estate developments, even if they end up acting as a safe deposit box for anonymous illicit money. We are told that public interest is best served not by caring for people, places, and planet, but by boosting profit-driven speculative development. And to sum it all up and foreclose the debate, Margaret Thatcher told us that there is no alternative to the status quo. This no alternative narrative has become so deeply entrenched that any dissenting voices are deemed to be the act of lunatics, idealists, and revolutionaries. And by implication, any progressive planning interventions are deemed to be barrier to enterprise, blocker of growth, suffocating people's aspirations, and so on and so on. The hold of these fabricated realities on our imagination has been reinforced by a misguided Foucauldian argument, which suggests that any form of independent action will be inevitably co-opted into the neoliberal agenda and hence won't make any difference. This implies that it's impossible to change anything without changing the entire capitalist system. This is then followed by a related argument which suggests that planning has become so deeply entangled in this system that it's incapable of invoking any alternative visions. Of course, I do not underestimate the contextual, structural problems and the challenging circumstances in which planners, especially in the public sector, operate. But my point is that succumbing to such pessimism risks generating hopelessness, stifling actions and evoking intellectual resignation. It blinds us to the cracks in the system and to the existing possibilities for prefiguring alternative futures. So to stop domination from becoming a fait accompli, we do need to decolonize our imagination. And to do so, we first need to negate how things are made to be so that we can reimagine how they might be remade. In planning, this means saying no to transformation of planning from a socially purposeful creative activity to a set of formulaic rules, procedures, and increasingly top-down executive orders and decrees. It means saying no to the ways in which planning's been turned into the supply side of land financialization, and saying no to policies and practices that are harmful to the health and well-being of people whom planning is meant to serve. If planning prides itself on serving the public interest, how can it possibly tolerate the creation of what is called 21st century slum housing in its name and in one of the richest countries in the world? As I said earlier, negating the given and rejecting the status quo is only one aspect of prefigurative planning. The other, perhaps more important aspect, is envisioning alternatives. So to paraphrase Zygmunt Bauman, it involves seeking places as we want them to be, not as they are, and in doing that, making visible what's been actively produced as non-existent or non-credible alternatives. And it is here that we can take inspiration from Ernest Bloch's philosophy and his reformulation of what is real and what is not. He suggests that what we consider as real in the present always encapsulate within it what is not yet real. So things that haven't happened, places that haven't been created, are not unreal, they are simply not yet realized, and there is every possibility that they will be. It is this uncovering of the not yet possibilities that generates hope and makes utopianism a constituent part of being human. But this isn't an abstract and fanciful hope. It's a radical and transformative hope. It's not based on wishful thinking, but willful action, action that arises from informed discontent with the present. For Bloch, hope is a praxis-oriented category, which urges us to step out of the present condition rather than remain hopeful in it. And it is this understanding of hope that underpins Bloch's notion of concrete utopia. I'll get back to it, but first, let's not forget that utopian thinking is not new to planning. Quite the opposite. Envisioning better places runs through the history of our field and has motivated some of its founding projects, notably the Garden City movement. For Ebenezer Howard, a garden city was above all a social city, a cooperative commonwealth alternative to the capitalist cities of the time, with residents owning the land in perpetuity and benefiting collectively from its rising value. Much of the early modernist urban planning was also in pursuit of creating utopias. The modernist functional city of the influential Charter of Athens aspired to be a city of salvation, in which the disposition of the land would satisfy the needs of the many as well as those of the individual. However, and as you all very well know, the utopia of modernist planning was an ideal end state, designed and executed from the top, and often underpinned by an elitist and alienating agenda. Much of it was inspired by Le Corbusier's model of scrapping the so-called old, irrational, and unplanned city and building on a blank canvas according to a rigid blueprint drawn by experts who knew best. As Bauman put it, it was a vision of pre-designed world in which prediction and planning staved off the play of chance. And as we know too well, the consequences of that kind of utopianism became very clear. Its unifying prescriptions led to the death of great American cities and left a trail of great planning disasters in cities and towns elsewhere. It is therefore not surprising that by the 1990s, its critics proclaimed the end of utopia and the death of urban vision. And since then, imagining how we might be otherwise has become a more cynical endeavor than accepting the worst conditions of the status quo. It seems that planning has become more at ease with accommodating the normalized today rather than pursuing the desired futures. And the distressing irony is that the collapse of modernist utopianism hasn't stopped the rise of dystopias. These segregated, commercialized spaces of gated communities, technotopia, and ecotopias instantiate rather than critique the no alternative narrative. The vacuum created by the decline of progressive urban imagination has been filled by utopic degeneration. So prefigurative planning is a call to fill this vacuum by enacting utopias in the here and now. This emphasis on the now doesn't preclude the future. It just redefines it as an unresolved form of the present. Here, future represents latent alternatives that already exist in the present, even though they are not yet realized. Thinking about the future in this way generates hope and drives us to take action. The emphasis on the here means that prefigurative planning is place-based and action-oriented. It unfolds through experimentations, which begin with questioning undesirable present rather than formulating a predefined future. The focus is on the process rather than a single preconceived outcome. The emphasis is on the journey as much as it is on the destination. As a collective process of enacting the future in the present, prefigurative planning is inevitably political and entails disagreement and conflicts. But unlike the command and control approaches of modernist planning, it doesn't seek to foreclose the debate. if planning is the last functioning vestiges of democracy in this country, as some people have argued, I suggest that prefigurative planning offers a way of sustaining and enhancing that position by reconnecting planning to people and making it more attentive to their views, concerns, and aspirations. A point worth mentioning here is that because prefigurative planning is place-based and context-dependent, its outcomes are inevitably contingent, uncertain, and potentially disappointing. But they are never hopeless. Because as Bloch insists, hope is not the same as confidence or calculated certainty. It's inherently open-ended, and precisely because of that, it can never be defeated or annihilated. Now, let me share with you this rather thought-provoking question. And I know that there is no easy answer to it, but it does make us wonder, doesn't it? And more importantly, it urges us to imagine how we might be otherwise. I suppose my motivation to call for a prefigurative mode of planning is to do just that, and do it both within and beyond the formal planning system. It's a call for questioning the given realities and envisioning alternative futures, not necessarily by producing more plans, but by harnessing planning imagination, and not by predefining the future, but by enacting the possibilities of the not yet in the here and now. As planners, we can and should initiate, forge, enable, and engage in alternative ways of spatial interventions from within the conditions of the present, but without being limited to them. And I believe that the time is right, because crises, such as those that we've experienced recently, often open a space where the tensions of what's been lost meet the aspirations of what can be next. They tend to unsettle fabricated realities and makes us reflect on what kind of cities and societies we want to be part of. During the COVID-19 pandemic, and amongst the tragic loss of lives and livelihoods, we saw a flourishing of self-organized, spontaneous community actions and a growing sense of solidarity. We witnessed hopeful possibilities of how things can be done differently. So we need to draw inspiration from that and from the civic energies and creative impulses that make up the urban life on a daily basis. There are numerous examples of community-led planning initiatives up and down the country and beyond. Lots of them, and I'm sure you're all familiar with: community land trusts, cooperative housing, community-led climate actions, gardens, pop-up parks, rewildings, etc. These may not be called prefigurative planning, but they share a common feature with it, which is the disruption of the taken for granted ways of doing things and the enactment of imaginative alternatives. A particularly apt and inspiring example, which made it to newspaper headlines, is a community-led, large-scale mixed-use development in a place called Foam, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's a market town in Somerset. And I'm going to read out two reflections by those involved in the process, because I think they perfectly capture the spirit of prefigurative planning. The first one is by Tina, the manager of a bookshop in the town, who says, I hope it's going to be a landmark moment for not just our town, but all towns. If you are tenacious enough, if you fight hard enough, if you know what you are worth, you can fight for the right thing. I think that is the message that places around the country really need right now, that bad development is not inevitable. The second reflection is by Fiona, a town councillor, who says, what's really exciting for me is that it's not actually about the amount of commercial space or the affordable housing it will provide, this project. It's about the sense of confidence, agency, and possibility that I think it will give us as a community. Another interesting aspect of this process is the role of planners and other built environment professionals who worked from the ground up with the community to transform the area. You can see here how one of the directors is stressing the importance of bringing together local knowledge and professional know-hows. And it isn't just communities who are challenging the given. There are also many examples of prefigurative actions by planners themselves in the UK and around the world. Some of the case studies in these books show that despite their challenging environment, planners and other professionals, even in NHS I have read about, have self-organized and carefully navigated power relations to break up, work through, or bypass rigid institutional structures and enact change in the here and now. And in doing so, they have not only mobilized hope, but also created the sense of personal agency and collective efficacy that Fiona was talking about. And here, you can see a similar sense of agency expressed by a young planner. In this seemingly small act of defiance lies some of the key ingredients of planning through prefigurations, which are learning as well as inspiring, humility as well as courage, especially moral courage, and deep listening as well as intentionality and a sense of purpose. I'm sure other planners have similar inspiring stories to tell, and I do hope that they are told loud and clear to inspire others and to counter the barrage of negative narratives that are targeted at planners these days. So to sum up, you'd be pleased to hear, prefigurative planning is a call for twin optimism, an optimism of the intellect coupled with an optimism of the will that is capable of fostering hope for better futures, however defined. It's a call for returning to a utopianism that doesn't settle on utopias, but rather embark on a process of endless questioning and enacting alternatives in the here and now. So utopianism in this sense is not about how to build that city on a hill, but how not to give up the pursuit of better cities with planning imagination and vision. I started my talk with a quote from a fiction writer. So it seems right to finish by a quote from a poet whose praise of utopia never ceases to inspire. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Simin. We have lots of time for questions before we enjoy our apple juice. I mean, just one comment really, and it's a bit of an anecdote that you ended on hope and imagination. Planning education has a huge role, I think, in instilling that in students and actually, dealing with the possibilities that lay in front of us. I received an email the other day that said that we should teach students how to process planning applications. Yeah, and obviously I've received that email periodically throughout my whole career. I did get a little bit angry, I have to say, but I think that really, I'd really like that person to come here and listen to you, because I think we have the starting point can't be the bureaucracy of planning. It has to be everything that you've talked about this evening. That's just a little bit of a soapbox speech on my part. But does anybody have any real questions?
Thank you, Simin. I echo what Nick said about wishing more people would hear this, and I'm so glad it's being recorded, and I will be resharing it. I think also it does echo not just the practice of what people are doing on the ground, but there's a wider sort of change here in the UK, but elsewhere, of leaders looking to strategic planning in a way that it hasn't done here for some time. But also, for example, listening to Mark Carney yesterday, the sort of courage and hopeful alternatives that people are trying to speak up for. And I absolutely agree with everything you said, but I do have a sort of theoretical question. So as you know, in the Bartlett School of Planning's Health Citizenship Research Cluster, we're really interested in these prefigurative modes or hopeful modes that people are doing for themselves, what might be done from planning. And one of the things that you didn't touch on, but I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say about it, is, which is the focus of our group, the embodied nature of the practice of planning as an emergent practice from the ground up. So thinking about things, having a hopeful mindset, building forward, and all those sort of intellectual pursuits from the perspective of the planners and leaders, I can absolutely see that and agree. But I think it's really interesting for me anyway to think about the end user stakeholder, not as separate from planning, but as part of planning, and the enactment of these prefigurative modes as a way to move forward. Yes, in the here and now, thinking about the future, but also there's something about the achievements and the embodied nature of what can happen that is beyond the intellectual activities that happen within planning, and how that figures within your theorizing.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you for, and I know that you have more sort of first-hand direct experience of some of the stuff that I was just talking about. So maybe you are in even a better position to share that experience with us. But I absolutely agree about, and I must say, I just, on the way to here, and you get really anxious about what kind of questions people are going to ask me and so on, and I picked up this paper which is about creativity and criticality, and I thought, exactly the words that I'm using in this paper. And it was very interesting, exactly what you said, because it was more sort of like a kind of a manual for how to do. And the point that I remember about creativity is what you're exactly saying, that when people are engaging in an experiment, whatever they're doing, it's that embodied sort of sense of being engaged in something in itself is a trigger of creative thinking. So creativity emerges from action that you get involved. So it's one of the ways. And of course, the paper was quite interesting in terms of do's and don'ts and all of that. But yes, I absolutely agree that it is the action on the ground. And you mentioned something about the achievements. The only point that I'd like to maybe emphasize is that we have to think about what do we mean by achievement. it's not always a pot of gold at the end of the road. Here is about the process is as important. The outcome is very unpredictable. As I said, could be even disappointing. And the learning happens as we do things. So that's the whole idea of this way of thinking about utopias, which is not focused on the end state, but on what we are doing now and how we're doing it. And that sense of agency and collective efficacy that I mentioned towards the end is part of the achievement.
Simin,
Hi.
thank you so much for your stimulating talk. It enlightened us in such a rainy day. My question is related to next one. It's about education system and what we as educator could do in increasingly top-down kind of environment, what we should teach, how we should teach, and also we face a kind of consumerism in education, and you presume what they want to know, our customer want to learn, and how can we tailor-make towards it? What's the implication for that from the perspective of prefigurative planning, and how we can translate this into our education?
Thank you, Fulham, for that. Yes, I think that is a question, obviously, quite an important question for us, as you said, educators. And I kind of very briefly touch upon it in the paper, and you've got to consider that the paper is an extremely short paper, almost commissioned for the celebrating of anniversary of European planning studies and all of that. So everything is so schematic, and it's really just thoughts put forward for all of us to develop, if we think they are, if there is any value in developing them. And over there I mentioned some very briefly about the implication for planning education. When it comes to education, I always sort of go back to Paulo Freire. That is very, and his ideas about the pedagogical sort of implication of all that. And what I love about one of the things that I've read from him is that he's got this idea that we should educate our students not necessarily to become problem solvers, but to become problem posers, in his words, which is very much about this critical thinking that we want our students to learn. And I think that's the answer to many questions about pedagogy. It doesn't matter whether it's planning, but for planning, particularly because it's a vocation, they go out there and they work. So asking questions is what they learn. And actually, and I'm sure they come up, whether we like it or not, we pass on certain values that we think are progressive values of planning to them. The real problem that the real challenge is that we teach our students that this is the kind of planning that we would like you to think about. This is what we understand what planning is. And then they go out there and they get disappointed. And they come back and say, well, we're not doing any of the stuff that you were talking about. And not just like prefigurative planning, but lots of other things when we teach them. It's all about, sustainability. We should pay attention to this, pay attention to that. Justice, social justice. But then they go out there and then they get, especially these days, bombarded with, how do I process a planning application? And you forget to tell me that, Simin. And I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't teach that, okay? Because they are going out there and they have to know how to do it. But that's not the end of it. And again, the hopeful part of this story is that when you come across planners, and some of the research that my colleagues and other RTPI itself has done shows that when you start having a proper conversation with planners out there, you will see some of the seeds of what they have been trained to achieve. So it's not all wasted. Deep down, many of them, of course not everybody, many of them And that's why they get frustrated, because they cannot practice the stuff that they've been taught, that this is the kind of planning that you need to practice. And that's quite disappointing. I always like to compare planning sometimes with the health professionals, really, because I think it's that the degree of care is not so dissimilar. And the same frustration that the health professional feel when they have to look after their patients in the corridors or don't have enough time, they have to do something very quickly, follow the protocol, the strict protocol and all of that, you can see how frustrated they are, because they don't think that they are delivering the kind of care that they've been trained to deliver. And at a different level, of course, not quite the same, the same applies to planning. The care for places, the care for people, the care for cities, for environments and all of that we keep teaching our students, they get frustrated because they cannot deliver that. And exactly because of the way the system is going.
Just to echo others' thank yous for the lecture, but also for the paper, which is a real gift and affirming in many ways, as well as an amazing resource for teaching. So it's actually a core reading on one of the modules I teach, which I can see some spatial planning students in the room. And I put it on there really because I teach about the history of British planning, and at times it gets rather depressing, and students want to feel some hope. So I try with the module to yes, the history of planning, but as a resource to think about the future. It has been otherwise, it can yet be otherwise still. And I do really think your paper is such a gift, so thank you for that. I have a question which is, I suppose, to do with the relationship between planning and community planning, community development, etc. Interested in, so Leonie Sandercock says, let's reimagine planning as community building, and then we make space for a great diversity of planners and planning beyond the state. But we have some research clusters, or we try to bring together the field of community-led development and the field of planning reform. These two fields do not talk to each other. Mm-hmm. And I'd be interested in your insights on how community development, community planning can become more of a resource for planning policy debates. Mm-hmm. And also just to say, I appreciate your acknowledgement that going in this direction can sometimes lead to disappointment, and we need to learn to sit with that amidst our grand ambitions. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really.
Thank you very much for your very kind words, and it's so great to know that it is of some use what's been written there. I know that. I know that what's happening in the field of planning system and reform of the planning system and all of that, and what's happening on the ground are not necessarily meshing up. But I really don't know what the solution as such is, apart from saying stay on course. Those of people, but it is. I think it is quite hopeful to see that these are not isolated examples of people working on the ground in different ways. And certain institutions, and here I have to put my hand up, TCPA, that I'm a trustee of, is advocating for that kind of planning. And we keep actually having these conversations with the members, actually, about we should be focusing on that. I mean, not necessarily exclusively on that. There are other things that organizations such as TCPA or RTPI can do in terms of the reform of the system. But they can also do more in terms of this connection between planning and people. RTPI is quite a powerful institution. I think it's got something like 50,000 members worldwide.
29.
29? But I always thought 29, but I recently saw a new figure which was much more than that. But maybe I'm wrong. But maybe it's an international membership rather than the UK. In any case, it's quite a strong institution. And I always think that, we can stand up to it. That wasn't a kind of just in passing saying, how could possibly planning or its professional institution, say nothing or doesn't say enough about the kind of housing that's been delivered recently? I mean, how could we just not say anything as a major institution and stand up to it? Because that is directly affecting people's health and well-being, the kind of housing that were built from the conversion of, offices and so on. But we don't hear enough of that kind of standing up for something that I suppose all planners think is wrong.
Hi, Simin. Thanks for the talk. I wondered if you had any thoughts about potential, I suppose, dark sides of utopia. So it seemed that you were thinking that utopia is inevitably progressive, but I think we could imagine, I think some extreme right-wing thinking is quite utopian in a very negative way. And do we need to do anything to counter that? Do you need to be aware of that? Or is it fine just to let alternatives emerge with utopian thinking and just hope, I suppose, that the kind of the more progressive side wins out?
Thank you, Ben, for that. Another person who raised a very similar comment was Erik Swingedal. Erik and I were on the same platform and I was going on about my prefigurative planning. And he got, he was just saying that. I didn't have enough time to elaborate on that platform, but he was just saying that, by the way, there is a lot of that happening right in front of us, a lot of alternatives. And you and he both are absolutely right. And that's what I'm saying, obviously quoting David Harvey's degenerating utopias are all around us. I mean, there are some unbelievable utopian projects that are being built. But the point that I'm making is that maybe it's the gap. We've created a vacuum there, as planners, urbanists, and so on, of coming up with a progressive, because nothing is without value, whether it's utopia or whatever else. And of course, when I talk about utopia, I talk about a utopia based on progressive values. And that's obviously, and that's where it gets into conflict and tension and the politics kicks in and so on. But if we don't do that, that is what we get. We get the dystopia, if you like, of some of the projects that are happening around the world. There is no other way. So we can't. So the answer is not to stop, and we cannot anyway, Ben. I think it's the utopian impulse is what makes us human.
Thank you very much. It's a really eloquent sort of defence of supporting prefigurative initiatives, and I strongly support that. The idea of supporting all those prefigurative initiatives that give us a different way forward. But I'd like to raise 2 points, if you let me, which relate to Ben and Mafamwis. So, firstly, I wonder if we could push you a little bit more on what the new alternative institutions of planning might look like that would actually make more space for these prefigurative initiatives. Excuse me. I mean, from my work on this area, that they are often very vulnerable. They need support. So how can a planning system sort of generate that support and create that support? And also, how can we deal with the fact that the way the planning system is set up now very often acts to block those? So I happened at a recent TCPA event, plug them again. Here, someone from the Saxondale Initiative in Frome talk about this. And it was very clear that the planners had been blocking this in favour of an alternative development. And although in the end they got permission for this, as I understood it, they couldn't get investment for it. So there wasn't anything in, the planning system was actually not helping with this particularly very positive initiative. And it not only was it blocking, but it wasn't helping with the investment to come forward to support that. So my first question is, can we think a little bit more about how the institutions of planning could actually support these kind of prefigurative initiatives. The second one is to pick up on Ben's point. And I've got a feeling my colleagues might disagree with me on this, so that's okay. I think we have a tendency, because we are a progressive profession, we see ourselves as a progressive profession, we encompass a certain range of views, okay? And so when you say critique the present, there is the assumption that we are critiquing that from broad left, broadly progressive left, okay? And I sometimes feel that we don't enable students, or perhaps enable ourselves, to understand fully enough the arguments that come from the right. Let's just crudely say left and right, okay? And enable to, we almost too quickly say that must be wrong, and here is the critique from the other side. And to understand and to develop that kind of critique. And I think that's really an important resource we have to get now, because you're right, the utopias that are coming forward are, you know, shiny Trump towers on Gaza. You know, that there are utopias out there that we don't wish to espouse. But we have to be willing to engage with the rhetoric that is coming from the right in a detailed, you know, taking it seriously way. And I don't think we're ready to do that. I think we're a bit scared to do with it. You know, I mean, it raises all sorts of issues about how you conduct that in a pedagogic environment. How do you handle issues of white nationalism in a pedagogic environment? You know, in order to unpick the critique of the present day that's going to come from some of these places. And, you know, we seem to be in a very different political place now where that is a possibility in the way that even 10 years ago wouldn't have seemed a possibility. So it's, yeah, two slightly different points.
Thank you, Yvonne, for all your thoughts and your comments, which obviously is exactly what we need to do. We need to take the debate further. We need to delve deeper into some of the issues and challenges that it kind of creates if you put something out there. And whatever I'm going to say is just to continue that sort of dialogue. On the institutions, we know the story, so I don't need to repeat this. Of course, I mean, the system is really stopping. I mean, I don't want to go as far as saying planning is the problem, because then I will be on the bandwagon of that culture that I mentioned. But the way the system is now is operating is not doing us any favor. And you're right that why should it be a battle to do a community project, to just say, look, guys, there is a piece of land here, and we are quite happy to take it over, develop it in this way, provide the affordable housing, do everything you want, well, let us do it, rather than bringing in a private developer. We do it better. So why should then that be a battle with the council? And we always talk about the planners is theory, because they kind of become the embodiment of everything else behind them is the planner. Some of the planners actually do believe that this is the right way. So it is true that this is the case. But then your question is, how do we change the institutions? And you know very well, Yvonne, there is a whole body of literature around how institutions change, you know. And there are all kinds of different theories and different ways of thinking about how institutions change. I got involved in that sort of literature, and there is a very interesting, strong, and I have argued for it, that one of the ways is what is called discursive institutionalism. i.e. ideas can change institutions as well. So because ideas are always getting dismissed as a force for change. But institutions change by the change of discourse, by the change of ideas, as one way of changing institutions. So I think for us, the only thing we can do is to continue with those ideas, with those experiences on the ground, which is better than ideas. And so changing institutions, continuity and change, as a kind of a dialectical thing. There are multiple ways of thinking how that happens. And then how can we trigger change, if you like. And I think ideas is one of them. But the point is, the real point behind this talk is that we cannot wait until the institutions change to do something. That's the point. Otherwise, we all know all the problems. If we want to wait until the entire, not only planning system, but capitalist system changes, I think, good luck with it. Wait. The whole point is, let's do it. And people are doing it. So they don't need us lecturing them. People are actually get fed up and start, and they're doing it it's always rather a small scale. And they never start thinking that I'm changing this corner of my neighborhood because then I want this to be scaled up. Usually people ask me, how do we scale it up? The whole idea of prefiguration is not a scaling up, it's a scaling sideways. If somebody else says, oh, actually we can do it this way, maybe we do it as well. And it is that this idea is promoting. So the first sort of idea is not institutional change. The critique is a very, very good point, and you're absolutely right. Critique can come from the left and the right and so on. All, again, we can do is to insist on the critique from the left. And there is a battle out there, and we are part of it. Even if we think we are not, we are part of that, and we cannot shut it down. Talking about how do we do it in the classroom, as you know, again, very well, there is now quite a growing sort of voices and literature about, for example, the decolonization of curriculum, including planning. And again, I think it's not about pitting one thing against the other. Again, the best we can do is to help our students to become politically literate, to ask questions, not to take things for granted, whether it's from the right or the left, even from the left, actually from the left. The whole thing is keep that inquisitive mind. And if we can cultivate just a little bit of that in ourselves and in our students, then our job is done. Because then how to do the planning application, believe me, they learn it on the job, if necessary. That's not the difficult bit. And I don't know, I'm just maybe sort of trying to be positive tonight. I think we are doing quite a bit of that. I mean, look back at all the models you're teaching, all the ways that you think about how do we do assessments and so on. We're constantly trying to think about new ways of making our students think. And I suppose if we can achieve a little bit of that, I think we've done our job. And a lot of it is done. And that is why we get them coming back and say, they get frustrated. Otherwise, they never get frustrated because then they say, yes, this is what I was taught and I'm not doing it, and they're quite happy. So, yes, but I suppose, but again, the point with critique is all good, and academics, we tend to do a lot of critique. But what, again, this idea is that critique is good and it has to be critical, otherwise it becomes like lifestyle, there is no politics in it. But with critique has to be creativity. So we can't just say something is wrong. We have to be able to show what is right. And therefore we've got to get on and people, even the public sector, we keep sort of promoting public sector planning. But people will only buy that story from us if public sector planning delivers something which is better than the private sector planning or development or what. And I suppose it is very action-oriented, this idea. It's not just critique, it's creativity and imagining. And I think we can think about ways of how do we actually incorporate it into our teachings or incorporate it into our institutions, cultivate that kind of way of thinking. And I keep saying that it's not just sort of let's put everything else to one side, all the strategic planning and stuff like that, and just get on with, like go back to the advocacy planning of the 70s. I'm just saying that we need these as part of the package. Otherwise, the planning seems to have lost the public anyway. Public perception is not very good. So it's not just the government and of course media plays a big role in it.
Thanks again for the talk, and really sympathise with a number of the sort of arguments and points you put forward. But I was just wondering if you could unpack maybe a little bit more. It just feels like there's an inherent sort of contradiction in prefigurative planning. So prefigurative's about action and the now, and planning's about the future and theory. The other aspect is like prefiguration is from sort of anarchist traditions, and then utopia has quite a different sort of meaning, sort of the Thomas More sort of no utopia. So it's never something that was concrete or actionable. So yeah, I think maybe leading on to that is could you maybe describe or paint a picture of what planning as a practice might be in this context?
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, utopia. It goes well beyond Thomas More. Thomas More coined the word, but before that, this idea of ideal city is as old thousands of years. You can easily go back to Plato. You can look at Aristotle's work, Polis. These are all ideal cities. You can look at the Italian Renaissance, how many ideal cities were envisaged, and actually some of them created, some stayed just on paper. And then within the literary field, Thomas More comes with his sort of fictional city of utopia. So it has a long, as you said, it has a long story, and the actual term is a bit unfortunate, and he played with that. Thomas More played with the word utopia in that way, which is it's a non-place, but it's also an ideal place, and so on. But as I said, if you think about it in a different way, not just cities, it's not a place, but a better future. Then it becomes something, as I keep saying, that it's built in us. We can't live without it, basically. We can't be human without thinking about something, a desirable future, whether it's for us, for collective, and so on. The theory, planning isn't about theory. I never thought about planning just being theory, honestly. And it is future-oriented. But the idea here with prefiguration is trying to, as I said, to reformulate this idea of the future. Because future is always seen as something that is not real. We can't touch it, We don't know what it is. But Ernest Bloch is trying to tell us that you can think about it in a different way. It is an unrealized future. It's a not yet future. So the seeds are already here. It is like a latent future. And the reason that he insists on that is because he wants to, that way of thinking creates hope. Otherwise, and that's the foundation of utopian thinking. And planning, yes, and of course it is practice-oriented. So this way of thinking is practice-oriented. Everybody's talking about examples of people doing various works. And planning should be practice-oriented, and it is. It has been. Whether it's lost it, I don't know. Maybe what you try to say is that the planning education very theoretical. Am I right? Because planning that is happening out there, there's nothing more practical than what planners do. They change our cities. They don't go and dig the ground, but their policies and practices actually create change in our cities and towns. So you can't get more practice-oriented than that. But maybe you're saying that our education is theoretical. I don't know.
Well, I guess if it's about grassroots action, then does planning sit as a practice about devolution and passing of power, or what are planners doing in that context? I guess
I think I am advocating, whether it's happening or not is another one. I'm advocating that planners should be part of that grassroots actions. They can enable it, they can initiate it, or, going back to Yvonne's point, at the least that they can do is not to stop it. So that's what I'm saying. And yes, and I know it's difficult. I constantly say, I know it's difficult. How much change can we do in our universities as an institution? Very little. But we try. Because what is the alternative? Do nothing.
Thank you, Simi. I have a very simple question. And so I'm a student. My background is public health and I work alongside planners. I'm acutely aware that I think coming from my background, I inherently see things in a more optimistic way, opportunities, and I think it's obviously been eye-opening coming in this course as well in terms of obviously the histories and just, it can be, some things are depressing, but I guess I wonder what your advice would be, I guess similar to what you were saying earlier, to a student going into the profession and the system, the planning system, I guess how, remaining that optimism, that hope and the possibilities, that's, through planning, I guess, is simply that. Yeah.
Thank you. That is exactly what I'd like to say to my students. Maintain the optimism, the fact that you can choose, and you see, and there are lots of examples of they are actually doing it in a small acts, little acts of I eventually did the right thing. I don't know if you remember or did you have time to read that. It's a very, very small thing, and it's a young planner just saying what they actually did. My proudest achievement is when I managed to persuade a very angry planning committee and my manager and his manager and his manager up to the chief exec to back an application that we had for a drug rehabilitation center in the town center. I think it was the right thing to do morally. This is a very young professional planner telling us that I am so proud that I fought through the system, navigated through the system, and got something done which I think is morally right to do. And I'm not saying somebody else might come and say no, that wasn't right. That conversation is ongoing. But in terms of the kind of stuff that planners can do, this is tiny. And this is within a system, as all my colleagues are telling me, has become more and more difficult to manage, to navigate, to change. But things are still happening. And this is what I would show to my students. I would like them to go out there and maintain that sense of optimism and hope that we can do changes.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for the very refreshing talk. It's been really nice compared to a lot of the content that we're reading and seeing. So, for example, someone from my class was just talking about how if planners talk like this in Turkey, they get jailed. And I come from India, so what I've seen with right-wing governments and the sweeping changes, especially in China and across governments currently, it's the utopias that they deliver come at a very steep price. Even when we're talking about the UK, so there's an article by Gordon Brown in The Guardian regarding inner city child poverty. So the target for 2028 is that 75% of children, 5-year-olds, should reach schools. A good number of them face third world rates of poverty in terms of they're still on Maslow's lowest hierarchy of needs, food, shelter, and clothing. A lot of my family works with these first generation learners who are going to school for the first time in slums in India or who suffer from cancer. So learning that these levels of deprivation exist within the UK, within the most prosperous financial centers on the planet, is shocking.
It is shocking.
It's scary. And it's very demoralizing. So this was a very nice talk to have attended. What I'm really stuck with is, at the same time we're applying to Savills and CBRE, we also want to be able to achieve some of this because of the reality of the job market right now. And also, this seems very difficult to achieve, that how do you create an urban environment where they can thrive and do more than just exist? They're shifting from house to house. They don't even have a toothbrush. How do you develop an urban realm where you mitigate the negative effects of this poverty, whether it's tactical urbanism, temporal, any small ticket wins? What do you see as a reality where young people can do more? Because what you were showing in the beginning of your entire presentation really spoke to that reality, which I've been learning more and more about. And it's nice to hear about the large scale changes, but it's the local effects which are borne by these people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what can I say? Apart from saying that it is shocking, and when I said about, when I said about the hard times, that's exactly some of the problems that we are facing a rising inequality. The gap between the poor and the rich is getting wider and wider, and we then sort of wonder why we have the rise of the far right, because a lot of people feel that no matter what, nothing is changing in their everyday life, and that's quite a dangerous place to be for any country, for any community, because what makes me worried a lot is that because of that, because people see government after government, different colors, different parties, they come and go, and nothing seems to be changing in their life, they basically then lose trust in the whole institution, democratic institutions, with all its imperfections and all of the problems. But these are the institutions that we think they are sort of democratic, and if people lose trust in them, where do they go? Then they listen to whoever who shouts louder. And that's the problem. But thank you for telling us about, some of the things that you can see on the ground. And this is exactly the kind of stuff that any planner or any other professional need to look at. And what we don't do a lot, we almost haven't done at all, I think since late Peter Hall, big study of urban containment, asking who benefited from it and so on. Since then, we have hardly looked at the outcome of planning decisions in terms of social justice, environmental sustainability, and so on. We never look at that much. And when I say we, I mean a lot of academic research, they haven't paid much attention to the outcome of planning decisions. We've spent a lot of time talking about the process of planning and how it should be more participative and so on and collaborative. And that is quite right and very valid, but we seem to have lost the plot on the outcome of the decision making. Should we get every planning local authority to have an assessment of their decisions and to see whether the outcome is socially just or not? They do a lot of assessment of whether it's environmentally sustainable or not. But do we do anything to see, if I take this particular decision, who loses, who benefits? And are there a group of society who are systematically losing? Because that's when you have to get worried about it.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. It's actually not a question, rather a comment, but it would be interesting to me to know what you think about it. Actually, I want to refer to the question of the colleague about this contradiction, I would say, between prefigurative and planning. And actually, I'm not a beginner. I know little, almost nothing in city planning, because I am doing my research on utopias from the perspective of political science and not political philosophy, not from city planning. And actually, this like dialectical, I would say, contradiction between prefiguration here and planning is very much, I think, connected with utopias, because it's all with like real utopias that are projects of future and not some just ideal states. And that's because you actually mentioned it on one of the first slides, because on the one hand you need to ignore some constraints of the present in order to produce some better project, and at the same time by planning you need to actually take into account many of the constraints of the present state. And that's this process of, as in Schumpeter, for example, of creative destruction. Like you need to ignore something in order to build something, well, taking into account some other parts of it. And here, I understand, of course, that in city planning, as I can see, the pendulum, I would say, is on the materialistic side of it, not idealistic. And because of that, this talk, this enacting utopias here is more about struggle against this materialistic, down-to-earth principles of planning. But at the same time, I think the critique towards utopianism is always about this idealism without any material constraints. So I think at the end it's about the balance between these two approaches, and I would say at the very end it's about institutional mechanisms to somehow to fixate this balance. Right. It's not a question, but I would like to hear.
No, thank you for reflecting on this, and it's so interesting to see that somebody else is working on utopia from a different perspective. Actually, some planners think they are political scientists, and they do a lot of their writing is very similar to political scientists. But the point is that you obviously you covered quite a bit, and one of the things you said about ignoring the constraint, maybe I didn't make myself understood properly. Actually, you shouldn't ignore the constraint. You should make them quite visible. And the idea is not to ignore them, but if they are constraints, if they are obstacles in front of the way that you want to go, is to overcome them the best you can. Ignoring them would be really a dangerous thing to do. And the other thing is because I kept saying that the first step is negating the given, and by which I mean things that have been normalized as is, this is the reality, accept it. And we do it, we do accept it. We think that's it, life is like that. Or the best way to deliver housing is to get a volume house builders to develop 2,000 in one go units. These are the things that we get as a given. And my point was that the starting point is to say, hang on a minute. That's not necessarily the given. That's one way of doing it. Go to another country and they do it differently. So that's the point. And then don't stop there. Tell us what is the other way to do it. Okay? So that is what I meant by this combination. So do not stop at the point of critique. move on to actually presenting alternatives, and there isn't any, there will be multiple alternatives. So that was the point. And then the material ideal, for me, these two, they are entangled. The ideal and the material are always entangled. And especially in the field, our field of planning, they are even more entangled. So there is, what is more ideal than thinking that you have improved that corner of your neighborhood materially? Okay, so they kind of, they're not separate. That's what I'm trying to say. They're not separate. And we want planning, our discipline, our field, to go back to become a kind of actually socially purposeful activity rather than a kind of a more of a technocratic exercise. And we would like our students to do that when they go out there and become planners.
Great, thank you very much, Simin. I think more than food, a feast for thought this evening. So thank you very much for your contribution to the series. And thank you to everybody here as well for the great questions. We were a little bit smaller as an audience this evening, but we've certainly had a good discussion. So what I'd like to invite you to do now is let your hair down with a glass of apple juice. And also, if we could finally thank Simin in the traditional way.
Thank you. Thank you very much.